Quick word about Greenberg Traurig. We are an international law firm with 41 offices on 3 continents. 31 of our offices are in the United States, 9 of which are in state capitals. This gives our government law and policy practice an excellent footprint to be effective across the country as well as in our nation's capital. This morning, we are hosting our second in a series of conversations with congressional thought leaders. We are hosting this new forum as an avenue for friends and clients to hear firsthand insight on important policy issues and understand better how members and their staff are being effective in this new social distancing time. This morning, we'll hear from a very thoughtful member and get his perspective on the pandemic-related measures, what the next legislative effort might look like, as well as other important issues. I am joined by 2 of my colleagues this morning. First, let me introduce former Congressman from the 4th Congressional District of Maryland, Albert Wynn. Albert served in Congress for 16 years as a Democratic member on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. We also have Republican former Congressman Rodney Frelinghuysen, who represented Morris County in the 11th Congressional District of New Jersey, where he served 24 years. Rodney's tenure in the House was focused on his service on the Appropriations Committee, where he served as its chairman until his retirement just over a year ago. We are delighted that Rodney joined our firm earlier this year. Now let me turn the program over to him to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Bob. Albert and I are very pleased to welcome Congressman Tom Cole. Let me tell you a little bit about Tom. He's represented the people of Oklahoma's 4th Congressional District now for 9 terms. Perhaps the most important thing is that he's a 5th generation Oklahoman, and he's an enrolled member of the Chickasaw Nation. He also serves where we had a very close relationship on the powerful House Appropriations Committee, formerly chair, but now ranking Republican member of the Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services. After the Defense Appropriations Bill, that is the largest appropriation that Congress considers on an annual basis. Wears a number of hats. The ranking member on the House Rules Committee, which means that any bill that goes to the floor, no matter who the sponsors are, is looked over by the Rules Committee, so he has input there. I think many people don't know that he has a PhD from the University of Oklahoma. He also had a Watson and Fulbright fellow scholarships at the University of London. He's a valued member of the Appropriations Committee, and we're so pleased to have you here today, Tom. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be with you.
You have had to adapt, as all Americans, to the current health crisis. I know when I called to ask you to participate, it was quite some time ago, and you had self-quarantined yourself back in Oklahoma. Could you tell us, why you did, and then could you sort of reflect on your recent visit to Washington to vote on another large congressional appropriation, and then I think your likely return next week to a subcommittee meeting of the Health and Human Services Committee chaired by Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut. But we'd be interested, I think, those that are listening, and we want to thank everybody for participating today, especially yourself, in terms of what things are like back at home and what you feel, how things are going.
Well, in terms of the quarantine, it was just simply a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people who happened to be very good friends of mine. I was in a deputy whip meeting. We were putting together the votes to make sure that we'd get an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote for what was then the second supplemental. I was working with our fellow appropriator, Mario Diaz-Balart, who's also a deputy whip. There were a group of us there. We were working the phones, lining up votes. That night, we voted actually very early on Saturday morning. Mario went home, went to bed, woke up very, very ill the next morning. The following week, I was already back in Oklahoma. I got a call from the attending physician that Mario had tested positive, and I was to immediately self-quarantined myself. So I never had any problem. I never had any symptoms, never had anything else. But Mario single-handedly took out about half the Republican deputy whip team, including the chief whip, the chief deputy whip, several others of us, a number of top staffers. But and he had a pretty rough go, but is well now. In terms of things back here, it's an interesting time in Oklahoma. We're like every place in the country. Obviously, the number one topic is the coronavirus. We're dealing with that, I think, fairly well. We've obviously not been hit anywhere nearly as hard as our friends in New York City or in New Orleans. We're not a hot spot in particular. We've had about 3,500 cases, sadly about 300 deaths. So it's certainly serious, but again, we're about half the population of New York City. They've had well over 20,000 deaths. So, it gives you some sense of perspective as to how difficult it is there compared to here. But we have the additional problem of an oil crisis here. The district I represent, major energy district, two largest producing counties in Oklahoma are inside my district. So when we see the oil field going down, and actually the old home, it's not the headquarters anymore of Halliburton, is in my district. So it gives you an idea, again, of how big an energy district this is. So we sort of have gotten a double whammy in that regard. But we are one of the states that's opening a little bit sooner. So I guess we'll be one of the laboratories to see whether or not that was a smart decision or not. It's gradual, and we'll see where we go from there. In terms of Congress, you're right. I was back, thank goodness, for the last vote. It is an eerie place to be. I remember when I came in, because I came in early, we had to go have Rules Committee meeting. Went to my office in Rayburn. I could look down every hall and not see another human being. I've never seen it, honestly, that empty. And the Capitol's a little bit ghostly. As you know, we have a rules office over there, minority rules office. And so I went over there in full disclosure because I like to smoke cigars, and I have the best cigar smoking venue in the United States Capitol right now. The speaker's writ runs in the halls, but it does not run into your personal offices. So H152 is a great place to smoke a cigar. It's actually the original visitor's entrance to the Capitol. A lot of history there. And the doors, which still work to the outside, with the doors the British supposedly came in August of 1814. They burned the place down. I always say, we can smoke here. This place has seen plenty of smoke. But we actually had a good Rules Committee meeting. It's typical Rules Committee, 9-4 in favor of the majority party. We considered Speaker Pelosi's proposal for an oversight committee, a new subcommittee, if you will, on oversight and government reform. That was pretty fiery. Obviously, the Republicans are pretty suspicious of that committee. We see it as a almost second impeachment committee. Then we had, a debate the next day, and it was really interesting debate because part of the debate was on the establishment of the select committee, and that was very much a partisan vote and very much a typical sort of slugfest on the House floor. Then we turned around and passed a $480+ billion relief bill once again for the fourth time in a row with essentially no partisan dissent. Now, there certainly had been some partisan negotiations. The major components of that bill were to refill the Paycheck Protection Program. That's what Republicans wanted. The Speaker had stalled that for about a week or so to get what she wanted, and she wanted more money for state and local governments, more money for hospitals, and more money for testing. And she got 2 out of 3 of those things. She got $75 billion more for the hospital, which I think was, in retrospect, will prove to have been a wise investment. I think the same thing's true for the $25 billion in testing. The real rub from a Republican standpoint was we were out of money in the PPP program. We were not out of money set aside for hospitals in particular. So it was, why can't we get this one done and then come back and deal with these other ones? So again, partisanship's not absent even in the most difficult times, but it was a pretty good deal in my view, pretty fair compromise. And now we're headed back, as you asked, next week. I'm very pleased with my chairman, Rosa DeLauro, is actually holding.
But you also mentioned the admonition of the House physician and how that sort of plays into.
Well, that's an interesting question there, Mr. Chairman, because I've been on a group call with the House physician. We actually had an approach-led branch call, which our mutual friend, former colleague of yours, Tim Ryan, and his ranking member, chairman, and the ranking members, Jamie Herrera Butler, and the physician does not take it upon himself to say whether we can or can't come back to the Capitol. However, he was specifically asked about remote voting, and he said, look, that's not for me to decide. My job is to tell you under what conditions you can operate the safest. You make the decision whether you're coming back or not. I mean, remember, the same attending physicians, also the attending physician for the United States Senate, they're back in session next week. He's clearly not forbidden them to come back. But he's laid down, pretty strict strictures. The Capitol's not going to be open to visitors. Most of the staff, obviously, not going to be there. They'll continue to telecommute. Everybody will be in masks. Social distancing will be everywhere. You can't go 10 feet without a hand sanitizer being immediately available to you in the Capitol these days, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So we will operate much as we operated last week once we're back in session. And again, I'm very pleased that Chairwoman DeLaura is calling our subcommittee back. Again, I've already participated in one committee meeting. It can be done. I mean, Rose and I were talking about this literally yesterday. And I told her, I said, I just want to know what the rules are, Madam Chairman. It's your committee room. Are we wearing masks or are we not wearing masks? I mean, I'll follow whatever the rule is. Are our witnesses wearing masks or are they not? Do we put them on and then take them off when we talk, which is, the speaker basically established that precedent in the debate over the creation of the oversight subcommittee that I mentioned earlier. So let's just set up the rules of decorum so I don't want to look like I'm trying to one-up my chairman. And I know she's not trying to do that to me. Again, we've had a very productive relationship over 5 years. I like to say when I was chairman, she never voted for my original bill, and she shouldn't have because it was a pretty Republican bill. But once we got into conference with the Senate and we had to do the normal give and take with the Senate, the bill always moved to the left in that circumstance. And she voted for final passage when I was chairman 4 times in a row. And so we have a lot of common aims on that subcommittee. And I returned the favor for her this year. Again, not voting for her original bill, but certainly voting for final passage once we'd sat down with Roy Blunt and Patty Murray in the Senate, come to a consensus, and created a bipartisan coalition in both the House and the Senate that actually moved the Labor H bill along, which is both of you know is usually the most contentious of the 12 bills the Appropriation Committee handles.
I know Albert has some questions.
Let me jump in for a minute. First of all, welcome. We're delighted to have you here, Tom. We really appreciate you giving us this time. I want to just say that I joined my colleague Rodney in complimenting you on your career. I haven't had the pleasure of working with you that much, although we did serve time together. But I always appreciated a couple of things. One, you're an institutionalist. You always looked out for the welfare of the institution as a whole, even above partisan concerns. The other thing that I always like is you're a professional. You understand politics as a give and take exercise, and you always work to see if we could reach an agreement. Wanted to talk a little bit about what comes next. There's a lot of eagerness and anxiety and some eagerness about what's going to be in the next bill, the so-called phase 4. And so people are anxious. Will it be more money for households? Will it be infrastructure? What elements of infrastructure, if any? State and local governments are also hurting and are in need of aid. And so there are a lot of those issues that people would like to get your thoughts on. Love to hear how you view this next upcoming bill.
Thank you very much. I appreciate those kind words. This is going to be an interesting one because I said earlier, we've done 4 in a row with no partisan dissent. That doesn't mean there wasn't partisan disagreement. But at the end of the day, before the bill ever reached the floor, we were able to come to agreements. And so what came to the floor had very significant bipartisan support. I think the last bill, we only lost 5 members or something like that total against the bill, which was a surprise. I would have expected more Republican opposition quite frankly. The fifth bill runs the risk of breaking that partisan thing. Now, again, my hope would be we avoid it, but the two people who are the key players here, as both of you know, are going to be the Speaker and the Majority Leader in the United States Senate. And the Speaker has a big decision to make because it's sort of her turn to go first. So there'll be a House bill out there. Does she want to, put a bill out there which is sort of the Democratic dream bill, which she certainly will have the votes to pass? But anything that passes along strictly partisan lines in the House is dead on arrival in the Senate, isn't going to be signed by the president. So her first calculation is, do I want to get a lot of Republicans on what I think may be a bad vote for them? Do I want to give a lot of my members what I think may be a good vote for them? Or do I want to continue this bipartisan program? And I don't, presume to know what her decision is going to be. But she's made a couple of things pretty clear. She's made it abundantly clear that the next bill is going to have state and local aid in it of some sort. Majority Leader McConnell, who originally opposed that idea a couple weeks ago, this week sent the signal back, well, I'm open to that. And then he laid down his red line, which is there's going to be liability protection in here for people that we're asking to do extraordinary things under difficult circumstances. We're going to give them some measure of protection, which the Speaker said that's a no. She is not obviously in favor of that. So to me, number one, I think anybody that thinks state and local aid isn't going to be there is wrong. Now, whether it'll be there in the amounts that the Speaker's talking about, which is up to $1 trillion, count me as skeptical that a number that big can happen. But I certainly think there'll be money there. I think there'll continue to be money at the healthcare end of this for hospitals and what have you. We've really put a lot of pressure on them by denying elective surgery. My own district, the largest hospital is Norman Regional. They're losing about $13-14 million a month by not doing elective surgery. Multiply that by hospitals all across the country, and particularly smaller rural hospitals where that's actually a bigger component. That brings a lot of pressure on Republican members who tend to represent those areas. So I think that will continue to be in there. I suspect that there will also be, what I would call, sort of cats and dogs, but they're very significant amounts of money. Most people don't realize in the CARES bill, a $2.3 trillion bill, there was about $30 billion for education, higher ed, student aid, and then K through 12. Those kind of needs are going to continue to exist. So a pretty big, set of aid for states and localities. That runs the risk of becoming more partisan. And I think the key there will be whether or not there are limits to the aid. Now, most members are hearing at home, you actually limited it too much last time by strictly being corona relief. A lot of these localities and states are suffering from an absolute collapse in their normal income flow. And so in my area, I'm seeing small to medium-sized town laying off, municipal employees and that sort of thing in the middle of a crisis because they depend heavily on the sales tax. If you're sheltering in place, not very much activity in that regard outside the grocery stores. Again, I think members will feel that. I would hope, too, that we begin on the infrastructure thing, which you asked about specifically, Albert. I think that's in the cards, probably not in the next bill. Again, the majority leader said, I think that's a little soon to do it. But we all know the president would love to do something like this. Money's about as cheap as it's going to be. The dilemma there for Democrats, actually, I think, and this will come later this summer, do we want to give the president a big win on the eve of a very intense election? If we get a big infrastructure bill through, there's going to be a big signing ceremony at the White House, and that's a big win for the president, in the middle of an election cycle. So it's going to be a struggle on the Democratic side. How many wins do you want to give the president when obviously your goal is to be successful in November? And that's increasingly going to move into these calculations. Now, again, as I say, I think people have been remarkably restrained so far. I mean, for coming out of impeachment, where we were about as divided as you can be, to moving 4 supplementals through, I actually give high marks to everybody concerned for being able to pull that off. It's just going to be harder and harder as the summer wears on and the election draws nearer to continue that.
Let me ask you this. Is there any possibility, as you describe them, cats and dogs, like surprise billing, which could be interesting in this current climate? Might something be worked out on surprise billing and included in this next bill?
I think it could be. We're pretty close to agreement. We have both the chairman and the ranking member, broadly in agreement on that legislation. I think people will be looking for opportunities to attach things to what's going to be a much passed package. Now, again, it'd be a lot easier if there's a broad agreement and the speaker forgoes, a sort of Democratic dream bill and says, let's hammer out something that you can get significant numbers of Republicans for. But that's an element that certainly I think could be attached to these things. A lot of these will depend literally on the discussions at the leadership level. And again, do you want to make law, or you want to make a point? You want to make an issue, or do you want to get something done? So far, they've erred on the side of getting something done. The other thing I think you could see, I'll be interested when we get back to see what my colleagues think. Just talking to my governor, my state legislators, again, they appreciate the help in the first $150 billion package. They're worried whether or not they can spend it all strictly on coronavirus, but they've got gaping needs in supporting Common Ed and, paying for law enforcement, those sorts of things. And so some of them have said, more money would be great. We don't want to discourage that. But first thing is you've got to give us more flexibility than you did in that first package. And again, we can have some barriers here. Nobody, certainly on our side of the aisle, wants to bail out a pension fund or something that was in problems before this. But I think you've got to give these legislators and governors more working room and recognize that they've got collapsing higher ed and common ed systems, transportation departments, things like that, that they're going to need to use some of these dollars to shore up as they get through this thing. And that's just my opinion.
Sure. Rodney, I know you want to talk about that legal liability issue a little bit more. I'll turn it back to you.
Tom, can you talk a little more about the whole issue of legal liability? I think we all have a huge admiration for, those doctors and nurses and healthcare workers that are on the front lines, but there are others out there as well. Those that are in grocery stores, did a lot of talk about pork producers. There's a lot of the attitude is you must stay open. This is a national asset. Lenders are concerned. The firm obviously represents a lot of different clients. Many of them feel that they need these types of protection. Do you think there is any possibility of any sort of short-term liability protections moving forward?
I do. Now, of course, as you can imagine, my Republican bones are of course excited, not excited, but that would be a normal Republican response. Tougher for the Democrats. But look, at the end of the day, let's just take the president made the decision recently, and I think it was the appropriate decision to keep open meat packing plants. I mean, I have a big agriculture district too. I have 13 or 14,000 farms and ranches in this district. And so I see production backing up for cattle. And I talk to my colleagues this is, we're not on Iowa-sized hog state. We have lots of hogs in Frank Lucas's district in northwestern Oklahoma. So, you've got to keep that going for people to eat. And for farmers to be able to get their stuff going. So the president invoked, as I know, the Defense Emergency or Preparation Act. If companies are that were otherwise, either suspending production or shutting down plants, have to reopen them, and workers come to them, then I think the companies certainly need some liability protection in situations like that, or they'll be swamped with lawsuits. And again, they're making a decision. They're being forced to make a decision. And I think a lot of companies are in that bind. I mean, a lot of companies, number one, are doing things because we've told them to do things. They're not doing things because we've told them not to do them. And they're making extraordinary changes. Let's say, a car manufacturer to a ventilator company. I've got a little company in my district that makes seat covers. Now they're making masks. These are people that have switched on a dime to help us out in a national emergency. I think given that, you've got to cut them some slack and give them some protection. And if there needs to be compensation for workers, that again, to me, ought to fall on the federal government, not on the companies, because again, we're ordering workers in some cases to go into places that are dangerous. Obviously, we always think of doctors and nurses, and we should, but I got to tell you, I got a lot of admiration for somebody making $15 an hour and showing up at a meatpacking plant to make sure the rest of us are okay. That person deserves a measure of protection, some extra help as well. But I don't think you can dump it on the company because, again, all these things are flowing out of decisions that have been made by federal and state governments, largely the federal government. And again, when you make decisions like that, I think you assume some responsibility for the outcome.
You have literally, I think today, postal workers still making deliveries, FedEx, UPS. I mean, the truckers are, they move by night. I know through my state of New Jersey, I can hear them, and they may move a lot faster than they ever used to. But I mean, there's concern, obviously, about their welfare. I think sometimes I don't think anyone's let them fall off our radar screen, but it's I think something which I think Congress hopefully may address in the near future. I'd like to shift for a few minutes. A staggering amount of money has been spent in 4 huge, what I call, appropriations bills. We're not forgetting, since you and I are part of an appropriations family, that we still have 12 bills that have to get through the process. And of course, the sum total, I think, of the federal budget last year was $3.8 trillion. So if you add up what's been spent in this emergency situation, there still is an obligation. How do you see the timetable moving, if there is one, the calendar, markups and remote hearings and things of that nature?
Well, the remote hearing issue has not yet been settled, of course, and that's a matter of considerable disagreement. I think on our side of the aisle, we're ready to do remote hearings, but not remote markups. In other words, we want voting to be in person, both at the committee level and in the chamber. At the committee level, I actually sit on an ad hoc committee that the Speaker appointed with the majority leader, the Republican leader, then the chairman and ranking members of administration and rules, respectively. So there's 6 of us, all very, very good members. I mean, Jim McGovern is a good friend as well as a good member on rules and administration. You got Zoe Laughlin and Rodney Davis from Illinois, the ranking member, and then obviously Steny Hoyer and Leader McCarthy. I mean, these are both institutionalist people of great ability, but there's a real disagreement. I'd say on the Democratic side, there's much more desire to push ahead with remote hearings and remote voting. I think Republicans very much more skeptical. By the way, that's changed literally in the last month. I would tell you a month ago, I think the spectrum of opinion was in each party about the same. But interestingly enough, I think Republicans have moved more toward the traditional view that these things can be done safely in the building with precautions. And Democrats, and it may literally reflect the geographic distribution of where members are coming from at home. I mean, a lot of our Democratic members, just think of the New York delegation in New York City and what they've been through and the situation they're facing in their home districts compared to what we were facing in North and South Dakota and Oklahoma and Kansas. Order of magnitude is much different, and that probably shapes how they view the institution should move going forward. But so first question is, can we come back? Leader McCarthy has proposed a schedule where we start bringing committees back literally he would like to do that next week. And you don't need to have every member there. You could have the Republican and Democrats, on things like armed services. We got to get a national defense authorization bill done. You could have the subcommittees. You wouldn't even need the full approach committees to get the markups done in preparation for the full committee. Then, the reality is the committee that's going to have the most work to do is appropriations. And nobody else has to produce 12 bills and get them across the floor. So I think that's possible to do. In terms of writing the bills, we've gotten most of the hearings done before this thing really hit us in April. I have a lot of confidence in my ranking member, or my chairman, and my former ranking member. I'd love her if she were my ranking member again. But look, she knows how to write a bill. Rosa knows that, and I have a lot of confidence in my colleagues on the other side of the bill in all these appropriation subcommittees. We're pretty good at doing this, so we can put together the base bills pretty fast on our subcommittee, which again is the largest domestic spending. Members have already submitted their priorities. We're already having these kind of discussions. Rosa and I have talked about this multiple times, where we'll agree, where we'll disagree, where we think we can go in a negotiation with the Senate later on this year. So, it really becomes a political decision. Do I think it's possible to finish all these things by September 30th? Yes, I do. Do I think we will, given the election? The temptation is going to be overwhelming to just punt past the election, try to do them in a lame duck. And if you get there, depending on who wins, I watched this last time. I would say the Republicans made a big mistake, in my view, in 2016, which is the classic appropriations bill. Rather than wrapping all this stuff up after Trump's election, before Trump became president, we kicked it in against the advice of the Republican appropriators into the next year. This was a leadership decision. And, I love my leaders in that era, but they made the wrong call because they immediately plunged the president into a negotiation. He didn't have his team put together. He hadn't seen a federal budget. I mean, you need to give them time. So I think it was a big mistake and created a lot of problems. We eventually got it done. Thanks to you, Mr. Chairman. You got it done, I guess, in late April or May, as I recall, of 2017. But it was very contentious, and it took a lot of give and take. And the bills honestly didn't look much different than they would have in December. And so the president got pretty upset because it was a major omnibus and a lot of things he wanted weren't in it. They were not going to get in it. And it would have been much better to do that on President Obama's watch than saddle President Trump with this kind of thing that early in his presidency. So I would hope, again, whatever we do, we finish our work before the calendar year, whether it's President Trump or President Biden. They deserve to start the year with the budget done, and they can look forward into shaping the next term without being caught and because Congress didn't get its work done. That's just malpractice on our part, in my view. It wasn't malpractice by the Appropriations Committee when we did it in 2016. It was, I think, a mistake by Republican leadership. I hope Democratic leadership does not make the same mistake that we made.
Thank you for your response. Robert.
Yeah, I want to follow up on something you said just real quick. You talked about the guy making $15 an hour working a meat packing plant. You talked about the nurses and the frontline folks. There's been talk of a heroes fund as part of either this package that's coming up or some future legislation, basically addressing the fact that our new heroes are the people who are working on the front lines, long shifts, difficult conditions, sometimes without necessary personal protective equipment. Could that be a part of a piece of legislation coming down the pipe?
I wouldn't rule anything in or out at this point. I certainly, would look at something like that pretty seriously. I think it'd be pretty popular with the American people. It's one of the things I have to tell you as a member I struggle with us not being in Washington. We're asking a lot of people to really do some very difficult things under much more difficult circumstances than we will be in working at the Capitol with appropriate precautions and reduced staff and no visitors and what have you. And I just think you lead by example sometimes. Congress needs to be at work. I feel very strongly about that. And recognizing the people we don't traditionally think of as heroes are doing heroic things, might be good for the country. So I don't know what form it would take, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I think the big challenge here, of course, is just the size of these packages. Secretary Mnuchin, who in my personal opinion, he has been a standout performer in all this. Frankly, my opinion of him has gone up quite substantially, and I don't mean it was bad before, but I've just watched him make Treasury a user-friendly agency, something that's pretty unusual for any government agency. And the speed at which they've moved money and their responsiveness has been quite extraordinary, I think. So Mnuchin's emerged as a real star. But anyway, he likes to talk about this. You need to think of this as a baseball game. And the first 4 supplementals were probably the first 4 innings of a 9-inning game. So there are lots of different things that are there that we've not yet seen, as well as Chairman Frelinghuysen said, completing the normal appropriations process. I actually personally think we'll be legislating off coronavirus for the next 2 to 3 years minimum. When you talk to members about things like, how do we restart the economy? You'll hear discussions about tax credits for rehiring. Obviously, we're talking at the member level very significantly about relocating the supply chain, obviously for pharmaceuticals, but for other critical industries too. Now that we've gone through this, it's a pretty good reminder of how dangerous it is to not have capacity inside the United States for a whole variety of things. So I think you're going to see some strange areas of cooperation and bipartisanship going forward, particularly in this idea of making us less vulnerable. Another area, Rosa and I have talked about this, and I'm trying to convince the administration, they need to present a public health budget that really throws their budget out the window. Remember, that budget's written in December of 2019. The world is not that before. So we're operating right now under very strict budget caps, basically flat caps. The reality is I actually have my staff working on a list of accounts what do we really need? You're going to need more money at the Center for Disease Control. You're going to need more money at Strategic Stockpile. You're going to need more money at the NIH. You're going to need more money probably in the food inspection, food chain area. You're going to, you just go through the accounts that, maybe we exempt those accounts from budget caps and tell the professionals to come back in. I would like to see the administration actually present a new public health budget, or public preparedness budget might be a better way to put it, because this thing is in waves and it's coming back. And we can't do to the country what we've done this time. Another interesting idea kicking around, talking with Senator Coons, a senator I really have a great deal of admiration for, and very pragmatic guy, instinctively bipartisan, about an AmeriCorps-like operation for young people to help us with this contact and tracing problem that exists everywhere, and then maybe an educational component that would encourage them to move into the public health care system. We're going to have to rethink public health care in the country. Most Americans don't realize this, but CDC provides about half the budget for every state health department in the country. In my own state, it's about 60%. Actually, the poorer and more rural the state is, the bigger component is. So we were really underpaid at the state and local level. We can sit here and lecture them, but the reality is you can't, defend the country one state at a time. You're going to have a public health component that's truly national in scope and is built up, over the years. It's not something I think you can do with what I'd call a one and done supplemental. You're going to have to look at baselines very seriously. And what is the baseline for the CDC need? And it may be a phased approach. You can't just throw money at it, but let's think in 5-year increments. Congress, going on a little long here, but Congress actually has a great record on this. And I point out to people, last 5 years, this was very bipartisan. It was a congressional initiative. We increased NIH funding, National Institute of Health, by 39% in 5 years. We increased CDC funding by 24%. We increased the strategic stockpile by 34%. We created 2 years ago, it took me 2 years to get done. It was actually one of my ideas, but Rosa DeLauro, very helpful, something called the Infectious Disease Rapid Response Fund. So we didn't wait on Congress to appropriate money. There was a fund immediately available that CDC could tap into. We did all of those things, and yet it wasn't enough. In 12 weeks, we saw the greatest economy in the world grind to a halt. And we'd done all those things because we'd seen SARS, we'd seen MERS, we'd seen Zika, we'd seen Ebola. So there was a real congressional awareness of this. And Congress, whether it was the Obama administration or the Trump administration, was actually spending more in these critical accounts than either of those administrations asked for. But again, still wasn't enough. I think now you obviously have the awareness. And as I told the Republican leader, look, I think it's time to spend billions to save trillions. Look how much this has cost us. So, believe me, the defense budget in January of 1942 was a lot different than it was in December of 1941. And you have an intervening event that changes everything in Pearl Harbor. We've had an intervening event that needs to change the way we think about public health, biomedical research, and biomedical preparedness going forward, in my view.
It wasn't well advertised, but you did put aside a rainy day fund for those purposes. I have to congratulate you. I think you've been a huge advocate for the CDC and the National Institutes of Health, and it sort of went off people's radar screen because it wasn't, sexy enough to sort of talk about. But today, even though we're short, that was foresight, and that fund was actually something you created.
Well, you let me create it, Chairman. It couldn't have gone anywhere if my chairman wasn't willing to back me up on it, and you did, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, Albert, we have to ask you sort of a question related to China, and the whole issue of supply chains,
exactly.
Buying domestically. This is going to be a theme, or is a theme now.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going away. It's probably be an area of bipartisanship, quite frankly. I was on a call recently, and Liz Cheney, who's our conference chair, and of course, quite a serious national security thinker and advocate in her own right, has organized a group of discussions on China. And on things, this one was over the supply chain, the pharmaceutical chain, what needed to be done. There's another similar discussion coming up. I'm sure comparable things are happening on the Democratic side. This is it's a tricky area. Look, I'm traditionally a big free trader, always have been. I recognize that, I'm old enough to have been thrilled when Nixon opened up China. I thought that was the right policy then, engagement. But China has not played by the rules that we all expected them to play by. And there's going to end up being consequences for that. Now, I don't want us to stumble into a new Cold War, let alone something worse. But if you're going to operate within the world system, you got to be a responsible player. The Chinese have not been. Give you an example. If you're a member of the WHO, you're supposed to notify the WHO within 24 hours of having something like coronavirus. It took the Chinese over 6 weeks to notify them. And they clearly used the influence they had within the WHO to sort of mute the warnings that should have been coming out. As late as mid-January, WHO is saying there's no evidence of person-to-person transmission. Everything we know about what happened in China, would say that's not the case. There was plenty of evidence. We just didn't have people being honest, or we had the Chinese when they knew they had a problem that they were not being transparent about on the international market and buying up personal protective equipment, those kinds of things ahead of time. So we can't have behavior like that. And, it's going to be an interesting relationship going forward. But it's one in which I think the United States is going to have to decide to literally establish, areas where it's going to make sure it's independent and self-sufficient. That's going to ruffle some feathers in China. I think so be it. The anger on the part of the American people on this and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who don't agree on a lot of other things do agree on this. I'm not sure what the agenda will be. I would not be surprised to see both presidential candidates talking about it quite a bit. But I just think, this whole episode has been so traumatic. It's going to shape American politics and American policy, not just for the weeks and months ahead, but for several years.
Congressman, you talked about preparedness. I was wondering, particularly coming from your region of the country, is there any conversations about rural broadband as part of maybe an infrastructure package? And also as it relates to education in rural areas, as we look at the possibility of having to have more remote learning. Is that something you've thought about?
I think about it a lot because I have areas of my district, where broadband is intermittent at best. We really have problems. So that I have no doubt if there's a major infrastructure bill, that will happen. It's particularly critical. Rural hospitals. Look, I do a lot of stuff on Native American issues for obvious reasons, partly heritage, but my district has 11 different tribes in it. But I spend a lot of time on reservations in other parts of the country that are very remote, very poor, very underserved. And so you really do have to weave the country together, I think, with this technology. This is the same as electricity in the 1920s and 30s when we had a major undertaking to, matter of fact, Lyndon Johnson was a big player in that, to bring electricity to all of America. And we all recognize it's more expensive, obviously, in remote and rural areas, but you can't have modern agriculture without electric power out on farms. I don't think you can have a modern economy, again, without this kind of system. So I think you'll find that rural Republicans and Democrats alike will do that. And I think, this is a thing whose time is coming. It's actually here, I think, in the next infrastructure package that we have.
You wear another hat as well. You're one of the senior members of the House Subcommittee on Defense, working with Pete Visclosky from Indiana and Ken Calvert from California, the ranking. Do you feel that our Secretary of Defense is up to speed in terms of making sure that we are prepared for every possible contingency?
I do. I'm a big Secretary Esper fan, but I'm a big fan of that committee, which of course you chaired, Mr. Chairman, before you were chairman of the full committee. That committee as well. That is the most bipartisan committee I think that I've ever sat on in my life. I cannot recall a single partisan vote on that committee in my tenure there. Even messaging votes, it's just not done. And I remember when Pete Visclosky moved from ranking member to chairman, he visited all of our offices, every member. And I remember his office called to my office and said, the chairman would like to stop by your office. And I said, well, my goodness, he's the chairman. I'll come to his office. No. He wants to come to your office. And he did. And one of the things he said, and he said this as a compliment to you, Mr. Chairman, and to your predecessor, and to Kay Granger. He said, Tom, I've worked on this committee for a number of years, and I've been the ranking member under, Chairman Granger and Chairman Frelinghuysen. I never felt like I was in the minority. I was a full partner on this committee. And I have to say, he's run it that way. He certainly treated us as Republicans exactly the same as he has Democrats. I think it's one of the finest subcommittees in Congress where people really do submerge their differences and try to find common ground for the greater good. So it's an island of the way maybe Congress used to work, and we all hope it would work again. But I feel good about the leadership in the Department of Defense, but I feel very good about the committee that sits there and works with that leadership to make sure that men and women that we ask to go into harm's way have the training that they need, the resources that they need to not only be successful, but to give them the best chance of returning back to us safe and sound. So, that committee has functioned very, very well. And frankly, I'm sure will continue. I'm going to miss it. As you know, Chairman Vliskowski is retiring this year. I think he's an enormous loss to the Congress. He was a great working partner to you and to Granger. He's been a great chairman, with Ken Calvert now filling in the Republican role, but really one of the really fine members of Congress.
Congressman, one of the things that are on a lot of people's minds is what's going to happen with our elections. There's been talk of virtual elections. The Democrats have actually already moved their timing back a bit in terms of their convention. How do you see the impact on the election, both at the national and the local level?
Well, let me talk process and then outcome. Process, I used to be a Secretary of State a long time ago in another life. And something that federal officials sometimes forget is we don't have a federal election system. We have 50 state systems, and they all do it differently. And I noticed the president recently condemning mail. Well, there are a number of states that are essentially all mail states, and it works pretty well. And there are other states where, like Florida, where it's an important component. But in the time that we have between now and November, I would be very reticent about the federal government trying to impose stuff. The Secretaries of State, actually the oldest body of public officials are the Association of Secretary of States, which is well over 100 years old. And having, again, served on their board of directors back in the 90s, or their board, I will just tell you, Democrat or Republican, they are awfully good, dedicated, and capable officials. So I would be listening a lot more to them, providing them the kind of help that they might need, but not trying to impose a one-size-fits-all system. And I think that's going to lead to chaos, particularly, with no chance to test it out. I mean, you look at things, and I don't mean this in a partisan sense, but the Iowa caucuses on the Democratic side should be a warning. Let's be a little careful here before we upset the system. Providing additional money, grants, that makes sense. But again, let's sit down and work with the Secretaries of State. Now, in terms of the outcome, it's an old political hack. I will tell you, a crisis like this usually works to the advantage of incumbents. It freezes the battlefield. You're a challenger. You can't raise money. You're not going door to door. And right now, we've had 4 bills in a row that everybody's voting the same way on, and that the president is signing. So you're not creating the kind of issue differences that normally pop up at this point in the election cycle. The Republicans are in pretty good shape just because of, when you lose badly in the last election, you usually lose a lot of ground that you might be able to take back in the House. So the numbers, there's a lot more vulnerable Democratic seats, and I think the impeachment move, which I think was a political mistake by the Democrats in my view, probably good politics for about 200 Democrats, but not good politics for the 30 sitting in states that the president carried, or districts that the president carried last time, likely to carry again this time, whether he wins or loses. You can pick up seats. We picked up 10 seats. Actually, as I recall, Albert, the year you got elected in 92, George Bush, only got 38%, but the NRCC picked up 10 seats that year and was within an eyelash of picking up another 10. So the terrain that we'll fight on in the House is good. Doesn't mean a House majority, but it is good. The Senate, I think the math is the opposite. A lot more vulnerable Republican seats, really only one really vulnerable Democratic seat in Alabama. I could see us losing ground. Don't see us losing the majority. The presidential, that's going to be a very interesting race, and I better be very diplomatic here. But I would just say elections always favor the incumbent. And the electoral battlefield still favors this president. And the real question will be, I mean, I think coronavirus and the opinion about how you handled it, and do we seem to be coming out of it in the late summer into the fall, are going to be the decisive elements. And when I say coming out of it, I mean not only are we making progress on the health front, but is the economy picking back up? Are we putting all these enormous number of Americans that have had to go, I mean, 30 million Americans out of work in a month? That's incredible. Those people need to be coming back to work, and we need to be doing the things to get them back to work. And that's actually the strongest argument for the infrastructure package, for things like tax credits for rehiring. I think that's good for the country. I think it's very good politics for incumbents. It's amazing how we all unite around certain things that help us get reelected. Nobody ever got defeated for voting for infrastructure. Nobody ever got defeated for voting for tax policy that helps put people back to work. There is a tacit alliance of incumbents around election time. And I remember in 96, back when I was a political consultant and I'd run the NRCC in the 92 cycle, magically, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton decided welfare reform was a great idea. It was great politics for Republicans in the House. It was great politics for a Democratic president. Probably wasn't very great politics for Bob Dole. Then all of a sudden they're making major achievements. They get a balanced budget deal, and they get a welfare reform deal, popular. Probably help Republicans hold the House and help President Clinton win a second term. And the interesting thing to me is, and again, I don't pretend to have any insight into what the speaker does, but she's got a conflict here in the sense, I know obviously she wants a Democratic president, but good politics would also be maintaining that Democratic majority. And you need to give them, in those 30 districts, in my view, something besides impeachment to run on. An impeachment in those districts is not popular. So you better be able to come home. Well, we had our difference with the president, but we put that aside, and you have a narrative building now. And we worked together on a recovery. I voted for bills the president signed in these supplementals, and I voted for fill in the blank later this summer, an infrastructure bill, something like that. And again, the speaker sort of pulled that out on the free trade deals. At the end of last year, the sort of new USMCA. That was good politics for Democrats in Republican-leaning seats. In rural areas, obviously the ag portion of that, very, very important in a state like mine. That creates an interesting set of dilemmas. And again, I have a lot of respect for the speaker. She's very able politically. So she's got to think, what do I do to elect the president in my own party? But what do I do to keep my majority as robust as possible? Because again, you could win a very close presidential race and still lose ground in the House of Representatives, just the way the seats are configured right now.
We're at the top of the hour.
It's been great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Albert and I thank you, and Bob and Greenberg. Traurig thanks you for all of your time. Albert?
Thank all of you. Great privilege for me to be here, and appreciate it. And hopefully the country will get back up and running. Congress will get back up and running. We'll do the right things. I actually think when history looks back to this point, they will give the country better grades than maybe we do one another in a partisan sense. I mean, remember, this is a virus 20 weeks old, and the whole world has changed in 20 weeks. And I think the response has actually been remarkably swift and able to this point. But it's been done on the fly, no question about it. And we need to think a lot more deeply about how we reshape our institutions and our economy to make sure this doesn't happen again. And that, frankly, we're in a stronger position to take care of our own and our immediate needs than perhaps we were when this thing overtook us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Albert and Rodney, and the behind the scenes team of GT for putting this morning's program together. Let me also add a very special thank you to our guest, Congressman Cole. Thanks for sharing your insight and wisdom. We appreciate the role you play in Congress, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Let me mention Let me mention our next two conversations with our bipartisan thought leaders scheduled for next week. Tuesday, May 5th at 1 p.m., we'll be hosting Democratic Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio. Congressman Ryan is a member of the House Appropriations Committee. And on Friday, May 8th at 11, we will host Congressman Greg Walden, Republican from Oregon. Congressman Walden is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. If you are listening to this webinar, you'll receive an invitation shortly. I hope you'll join us. Thank you again, and have a great day.